August 19th, 1942, Dieppe, France. The metal door of the landing craft dropped open at exactly 5:20 in the morning. Canadian soldier Jack Poulton took one step forward. He did not step onto a beach. He stepped into a killing zone. Machine gun bullets tore through the air around him like angry hornets. The sound was deafening. Men fell before they could take 3 steps. Poulton had no idea that his nightmare was about to save D-Day. He had no idea that the disaster happening around him would completely change how the Allies won World War II. All he knew was that his friends were dying, and he might be next. This was supposed to be a quick raid. Get in, destroy some German targets, capture some prisoners, and get out. The Canadian commanders told the men it would take about 15 hours. They would be home by dinner. But as Poulton watched the man next to him collapse into the cold water, he knew something had gone terribly wrong. The beach in front of him was covered in smooth stones the size of eggs. You could not run on these stones. You could not dig into them for cover. And worst of all, you could not hide from the German guns that pointed down from the cliffs above. Every Canadian soldier on that beach was completely exposed. They were like targets at a shooting range. The Germans had perfect aim. The Canadians had nowhere to go. The disaster at Dieppe would kill or wound 68% of the 6,000 men who landed there that morning. In just 9 hours, over 3,300 Canadian soldiers would become casualties. Nearly 1,000 would die. Almost 2,000 would be captured and sent to prisoner of war camps. The raid would fail every single one of its objectives. The British newspapers would call it a catastrophe. Canadian families would call it murder. But what nobody knew on that terrible August morning was that every bullet, every death, every failure was teaching the Allies something crucial. The men dying on the beaches of Dieppe were answering questions that would save over 80,000 lives when the Allies returned to France 2 years later on D-Day. But why were these men even here? Why would the Allies attack this heavily defended French port town in broad daylight? To understand that, you have to understand how desperate the summer of 1942 was for the Allied forces. The Nazis controlled almost everything. Hitler's armies had conquered 3.5 million square miles of territory. That is bigger than the entire United States. German soldiers stood guard from the coast of France all the way to the edges of Moscow. In the east, the Soviet Union was bleeding to death. By the middle of 1942, the Soviets had lost over 4 million soldiers fighting the Germans. 4 million. Every day, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin sent angry messages to Britain and America. He demanded they open a second front in Western Europe. He needed the Germans to fight on 2 sides at once. Otherwise, Stalin warned, the Soviet Union might have to make peace with Hitler. That would leave Nazi Germany unbeatable. America had just entered the war after Pearl Harbor. President Franklin Roosevelt wanted action too. He wanted to prove to the American people that joining the war was the right choice. He wanted American soldiers to fight Germans, not just train in England. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was caught in the middle. He knew Britain was not ready for a full invasion of Europe. The British Army had been kicked off the continent at Dunkirk 2 years earlier. They had been building their strength back ever since. But Churchill also knew he could not afford to lose Stalin as an ally. He could not afford to look weak to Roosevelt. Something had to be done. The compromise was a raid. Not a full invasion, but something big enough to look serious. Something that would test German defenses. Something that would gather information about what it took to assault Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The Atlantic Wall was the line of bunkers, guns, and fortifications the Germans had built along the entire coast of occupied Europe. It stretched for thousands of miles. Nobody in the Allied command knew how to break through it. Nobody had ever tried to invade a heavily defended coast like this before. How many men would it take? What kind of ships? Could tanks land on beaches? How strong were German defenses really? These were questions that needed answers, and the only way to get those answers was to try. So they chose Dieppe. It was a small port town on the French coast straight across the English Channel from England. It had a population of about 25,000 people. Intelligence reports said the German defenses there were moderate, not too strong, not too weak, perfect for a test. The plan seemed simple enough: land at dawn with about 6,000 men, mostly Canadians. The Canadian 2nd Division had been training in England since 1940. They were ready. They were eager. Many had never seen combat. They wanted their chance to fight. The plan was to destroy the port, capture some Germans, grab some invasion barges, and get out before the German reinforcements could arrive. 15 hours, start to finish. But the plan had fatal flaws. The commanders assumed they would have surprise on their side. They assumed air support would be enough. They assumed their tanks could climb over the seawall. They assumed wrong. What they did not know was that German guns sat on top of the cliffs with perfect views of the beach. What they did not know was that the beach was pure stone, not sand. What they did not know was that their Churchill tanks would get stuck. What they did not know would cost the lives of nearly 1,000 young men. 6,000 men, mostly Canadian, were about to find out the answer to an impossible question the hardest way possible. What they learned in the next 9 hours would cost them everything, but it would save hundreds of thousands of lives 2 years later. And none of them would ever know the truth about what they were about to accomplish. In the early months of 1942, Britain stood alone against Nazi Europe. For 2 long years, the British had fought without major allies on the continent. France had fallen. Most of Europe had fallen. Only Britain remained free, protected by the English Channel and the Royal Navy. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Britain finally had a partner in the fight. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, America joined the war too. But having allies created new problems for British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Stalin was screaming for help. The Soviet Union was taking massive losses fighting the Germans on the Eastern Front. Every week, Stalin sent messages demanding that Britain open a second front in Western Europe. He wanted the Germans to fight on 2 sides at once. He even threatened to make a separate peace with Hitler if the Western Allies did not act soon. President Roosevelt wanted action as well. America had sent hundreds of thousands of soldiers to Britain, but they were just sitting there training. The American public wanted to see their boys fighting, not waiting. Churchill was trapped. He knew Britain was not ready for a full-scale invasion of France. The British Army had barely escaped from Dunkirk with their lives 2 years earlier. They did not have enough landing craft. They did not have enough trained men. They did not have the equipment needed to break through the Atlantic Wall. But Churchill also knew he could not afford to lose Stalin or disappoint Roosevelt. The solution was a compromise. They would launch a large raid on the French coast. It would not be a full invasion, but it would be big enough to look serious. It would test German defenses, gather important information, and boost morale. Most importantly, it would show Stalin and Roosevelt that Britain was doing something. They needed troops for this raid. The choice fell on the Canadians. 5,000 men from the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division would form the main force. Why Canadians? They had been training in Britain since 1940, waiting for their chance to fight. They were ready, they were well trained, and they were eager for action. Using Canadian troops also made political sense. It showed that the British Commonwealth was united in the fight against Hitler. The average Canadian soldier in the division was 21 or 22 years old. They came from all over Canada, farm boys from Saskatchewan, loggers from British Columbia, fishermen from Nova Scotia, factory workers from Ontario. Most had never been in combat. Most had never even left Canada before the war. Their commander was Major General John Hamilton Roberts, though the overall British commander was Lord Louis Mountbatten, the head of combined operations. The target was the French port town of Dieppe. It sat right across the English Channel from England, making it an easy trip. Intelligence reports said the town had moderate German defenses. Not too strong, not too weak. The population was about 25,000 people. The plan, called Operation Jubilee, seemed straightforward enough. The Canadians would land at dawn. They would destroy the port facilities to prevent the Germans from using them. They would capture German prisoners to interrogate. They would seize any invasion barges they found. They would hold the town for about 15 hours. Then they would withdraw on the afternoon high tide and sail back to England. Simple, quick, in and out. But the plan had serious problems that nobody seemed to notice. The commanders made dangerous assumptions. They assumed the German defenses were moderate, but they had not confirmed this with recent intelligence. They assumed air superiority would make up for weak naval support. Only 8 destroyers would provide gunfire to support the landing. They assumed surprise would work in their favor. They assumed their Churchill tanks could climb over the 10-foot seawall that surrounded the beach. All of these assumptions were wrong. The intelligence was also terrible. Nobody knew about the German gun positions hidden on top of the cliffs. Nobody realized how strong the concrete bunkers really were. And worst of all, nobody knew the beach was made of smooth stones instead of sand. Tanks cannot drive on stones. Soldiers cannot run on stones. You cannot dig into stones for protection. These gaps in knowledge would prove fatal. What did normal look like before the raid? Throughout the summer of 1942, the Canadian soldiers trained on the southern coast of England. They practiced landing from boats. They practiced storming beaches. They practiced coordinating with tanks and aircraft. They did this over and over until they could do it in their sleep. Confidence was high among the men. They had rehearsed this landing dozens of times. They felt ready. Letters home that summer talked about finally getting into action. The men wrote about showing the Germans what Canadians could do. They were tired of waiting. They wanted to prove themselves. The night of August 18, 1942 was quiet. Some men played cards in the cramped landing craft that would carry them across the channel. Some wrote final letters to loved ones back home. Some tried to sleep despite the nerves and excitement. A few joked about what French wine they would find in Dieppe. Most were too excited to be scared. They thought they were ready. They thought they knew what was coming. They had trained for this exact mission for months. But no amount of training could prepare them for what they would face when those landing craft doors dropped open at dawn. No training exercise had ever included the sound of real bullets. No practice run had ever shown them what it felt like when the man next to you fell dead. They were about to learn the difference between training and war, and the lesson would cost nearly 1,000 of them their lives. The crossing of the English Channel began in darkness. 237 ships left. England carrying the assault force toward France. It was 4:30 in the morning on August 19, 1942. The sea was calm. The night was quiet. In the landing craft, Canadian soldiers sat shoulder to shoulder in the dark. Some were seasick from the waves. Others were too nervous to feel sick. They could hear the engines of their boats rumbling through the water. They could smell the salt air and the diesel fuel. Most tried not to think about what was coming. But at 3:47 in the morning, disaster struck before the raid even began. One group of landing craft accidentally ran into a German convoy in the dark. Gunfire erupted in the middle of the channel. The noise echoed across the water. Any chance of surprise was now gone. The German defenders in Dieppe were wide awake and ready when the Canadians finally approached the shore. At 5:20 in the morning, the first landing craft hit the beaches. The doors dropped open. The men rushed forward into hell. At Blue Beach, near the village of Puis, the Royal Regiment of Canada charged off their boats and ran straight into a wall of bullets. German machine guns fired down from the cliffs above. The Canadians had no cover. The beach was narrow and surrounded by high walls. Within minutes, men were piled on top of each other, dead and wounded mixed together. By the end of the day, 97% of the Royal Regiment would be killed, wounded, or captured. 97%. Almost the entire unit wiped out in less than an hour. At Green Beach near Pourville, the South Saskatchewan Regiment had slightly better luck. They managed to get off the beach and into the town. But German reinforcements quickly surrounded them. They fought hard but were trapped. At the main beaches in front of Dieppe itself, Red Beach and White Beach, the assault turned into a complete catastrophe. This is where the disaster truly revealed itself. The sound hit the men first. German MG-42 machine guns fired at a rate of 1,200 rounds per minute. That is 20 bullets every single second. The sound was like cloth being ripped apart, over and over, never stopping. Tracer rounds cut through the air in bright lines, creating geometric patterns of death across the beach. The landing craft doors opened, and men saw cliffs bristling with weapons. Every gun seemed to be pointed directly at them. The beach was not sand like they expected. It was covered in smooth stones the size of eggs. Running on these stones was nearly impossible. The soldiers were carrying 90 pounds of equipment on their backs. Guns, ammunition, radio equipment, food, water. Trying to run across loose stones while carrying 90 pounds and being shot at was like trying to run through a nightmare where your legs would not work. The weather made it worse. It was a bright, cloudless morning. There was no fog to hide in, no rain to reduce visibility. The German gunners on the cliffs had perfect light to see their targets. Every Canadian on that beach was completely exposed, and since the beach was solid stone, they could not dig holes for protection. They could only press themselves flat against the rocks and pray. At 6:06 in the morning, 29 Churchill tanks landed on the main beach. This was the first time in history that tanks had been used in an amphibious assault. The British were proud of these tanks. They thought the tanks would break through the German defenses and clear a path for the infantry. But the beach stones immediately jammed the tank tracks. The tanks could barely move. Then they encountered the 10-foot seawall that ran along the waterfront. The wall was too high. The tanks could not climb it. 15 tanks became stuck on the beach, unable to advance. They sat there like stationary targets while German anti-tank guns destroyed them one by one. Not a single tank made it past the waterfront. The tank crews sat inside their steel boxes, listening to German shells pound against their armor, knowing they could not move, knowing they were trapped. Different people saw the disaster from different perspectives. Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Merritt of the South Saskatchewan Regiment became a hero that day. He stood on a bridge under heavy fire, waving his helmet and shouting to his men to follow him. "Come on over, there's nothing to worry about here," he yelled, even as bullets zinged past his head. His courage was incredible, but it could not change the fact that his men were being slaughtered. From the German side, Lieutenant Colonel Hermann Bartelt watched from his concrete bunker on the cliff. He could not believe the Allies were attacking such a fortified position in broad daylight. It seemed like suicide. Out at sea, British destroyer commanders watched through their binoculars as the disaster unfolded on the beaches. They fired their guns at German positions, but it was not enough. They could not provide the heavy bombardment the soldiers needed. They felt helpless watching men die. The numbers told the terrible story. By 7:00 in the morning, over 1,000 Canadians were already dead or wounded on the beaches. German casualties were fewer than 100. The math was brutal. For every German hit, 15 to 20 Canadians fell. Over 30% of the landing craft were destroyed or disabled, burning in the shallow water. Bodies floated in the waves. The beach was covered with abandoned equipment and fallen men. At 9 in the morning, the commanders offshore faced an impossible choice. Should they send in reinforcements and try to salvage the mission? Or should they order a withdrawal and cut their losses? They made the worst possible decision. They sent in the reserves. The Fusiliers Mont Royal, fresh French-Canadian troops, were ordered to land and support the attack. These men were butchered the moment their landing craft doors opened. They died without accomplishing anything. By 11th hour in the morning, it was clear to everyone that the raid had failed completely. The order came to evacuate. But evacuation was nearly impossible under the heavy German fire. Many men were stranded on the beaches with no way to reach the boats. They had to choose between dying where they stood or surrendering. Everything hung in the balance, and the balance was tipping toward total disaster. Between 11:30 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon, everything that could go wrong at Dieppe reached its final, terrible conclusion. The evacuation order had been given, but getting off the beach alive was almost impossible. Landing craft tried to get close to shore to pick up survivors, but German machine guns tore into them. Some boats made it to the beach, only to be hit by artillery shells. They exploded in shallow water, killing the men they came to save. Other boats could not get close enough, because of the burning wreckage blocking the way. Men waded into the water up to their chests, trying to swim to the boats. Many drowned under the weight of their equipment. Others were shot while exposed in the open water. The chaos was complete. Officers shouted orders that nobody could hear over the constant roar of gunfire. Radios were destroyed or lost. Communication between the beach and the ships offshore had broken down almost completely. Small groups of soldiers made the hardest choice anyone can make. They stayed behind to buy time for others to escape. These rearguard actions were acts of incredible courage. Men who knew they would die or be captured held positions so their friends might have a chance to reach the boats. Corporal Fred Engelbrecht was one of these men. He found himself near a group of badly wounded Canadians who could not move on their own. Boats were leaving. He could have run for one. He could have saved himself. Instead, he stayed with the wounded. He knew what this meant. He would be captured. He would spend years in a German prisoner of war camp. But someone had to stay with the wounded, and Engelbrecht decided it would be him. Years later, he would say simply, "They were my friends. Someone had to stay." The beach was now a graveyard of broken equipment and broken men. Churchill tanks sat burning, black smoke pouring from their hatches. Abandoned rifles lay scattered across the stones. Helmets, backpacks, medical supplies. Everything the Canadians had brought lay strewn across the beach like garbage. Bodies floated in the surf where the waves pushed them back and forth. The smell of gunpowder and smoke filled the air. The sound of wounded men calling for help mixed with the ongoing crack of rifle fire. Some men lay perfectly still, pretending to be dead, hoping the Germans would not notice them. Others crawled toward any cover they could find, leaving trails of blood on the stones behind them. But while the Canadians were dying, something else was happening that nobody on the beach knew about. Allied observers were documenting everything. Officers on the ships offshore were taking notes. What kind of obstacles blocked the tanks? How effective was the naval gunfire? What happened when landing craft hit a defended beach? Every failure was being recorded. Every problem was being written down. The beach composition mattered, they noted. Stones are impassable for tanks and running soldiers. Tanks need special modifications to handle beach obstacles. Frontal assault on a defended port is suicide, they realized. The timing of tides is crucial for landing craft to work properly. Air superiority alone is not enough. You need massive naval bombardment to suppress enemy guns. The Germans will defend ports to the death, so you must land between ports, not directly on them. You need specialized landing craft designed for different types of terrain. Communication between sea, air, and land forces must be perfect, or everything falls apart. Each of these lessons was being written in Canadian blood. Every Canadian who died was answering a question that Allied planners needed answered. Can tanks land on beaches? The answer, written in 15 destroyed Churchills, was not without special equipment. Can you take a fortified port by direct assault? The answer, written in nearly 1,000 dead Canadians, was absolutely not. What kind of naval support do you need? The answer was much, much more than 8 destroyers. The men fighting and dying on the beach had no idea they were teaching these lessons. They thought they were failing. They thought their mission was pointless. They had no way to know that every mistake, every death, every failure was being carefully studied by the planners who would organize D-Day 2 years later. The human experience of those final hours was pure fear, mixed with courage. Men watched their friends die and knew they were probably next. Some were paralyzed by terror, unable to move. Others found courage they did not know they had. Medics ran through machine gun fire to drag wounded men to shelter. Officers tried to maintain order even as their units fell apart around them. There was massive confusion. Some soldiers received orders to advance. Others received orders to retreat. Some received no orders at all because their commanders were dead. The determination of some men was remarkable. Small groups kept fighting even when the situation was completely hopeless. They fought because their friends were fighting. They fought because they did not know what else to do. They fought because surrendering felt like giving up on everyone who had already died. Finally, around 1 a.m. in the afternoon, the moment came that defined the day. Over 2,000 Canadian soldiers began to raise their hands in surrender. They stood up slowly from behind whatever cover they had found. They raised their rifles above their heads or waved white cloth. German soldiers emerged cautiously from their bunkers and positions. Some Germans seemed almost as shocked as the Canadians. They had just fought off a major Allied invasion, but they could not understand why the Allies had tried such an obviously suicidal attack. The Germans moved carefully across the beach, rounding up prisoners. Some showed mercy to the wounded. Others were rough with their captives. Most simply looked tired. The battle was over. By 2 in the afternoon, the raid on Dieppe was finished. The last boats had pulled away from shore carrying whoever they could save. Behind them, they left nearly 2,000 prisoners and over 900 dead. The butcher's bill was only beginning to be counted. On the ships heading back to England, medics worked frantically on the wounded. Men sat in shock, unable to process what had just happened. Some cried, some stared at nothing. Some asked over and over where their friends were, not accepting that they were gone. On the bridge of the command ship, British commanders stood in stunned silence. They had just watched the Allied assault plan completely fail. Everything had gone wrong. Every assumption had been proven false. Back in Dieppe, the Germans were celebrating their victory. They had defeated a major Allied attack with relatively light casualties. They had killed or captured thousands of enemy soldiers. Their defenses had worked perfectly. But some German officers were confused. Why had the Allies attacked such a heavily fortified position in broad daylight? It made no sense. What were they trying to accomplish? The Germans did not realize that the Allies had just learned exactly what they needed to know. They had learned what not to do, and that lesson, purchased with Canadian lives, would make D-Day possible 2 years later. The numbers came in slowly, each one worse than the last. Out of 4,163 Canadians who landed at Dieppe, 3,367 became casualties. That is a 68% casualty rate. More than 2 out of every 3 men who landed were killed, wounded, or captured. 916 Canadians were dead. 586 were wounded badly enough to need immediate medical care. 1,946 were now prisoners of the Germans, facing years in prison camps. The supporting forces suffered too. The Royal Navy and British commandos lost 275 men. The Royal Air Force lost 550 men when 106 aircraft were shot down over Dieppe. On the German side, only 591 casualties total. Only 311 Germans were killed. The mathematics of disaster were clear. For every single German who died, 3 Canadians died. The raid had been a slaughter. The Canadian survivors who made it back to England were in shock. Major Brian McCool, who was captured on the beach, later said, "We never had a chance. It was murder." Another soldier, Corporal James Lesask, was evacuated with terrible wounds. He kept asking the same question over and over. "I saw my friends die for nothing. How do we tell their families this meant something?" Many survivors felt crushing guilt. Why did they live when their friends died? What made them special? What made them deserve to survive? These questions haunted them for the rest of their lives. Some men could not talk about Dieppe for decades. The memories were too painful. Others could not stop talking about it, desperately trying to make sense of what happened. The 2,000 Canadian prisoners were beginning 3 years of captivity in German prisoner of war camps. At first, the Germans treated them relatively well according to the Geneva Convention rules for prisoners. The Canadians were given food, shelter, and medical care for their wounds. But in the fall of 1942, something changed. The British had captured a German document that ordered the shackling of prisoners. In response, the British shackled their German prisoners. The Germans then shackled the Dieppe prisoners in retaliation. Canadian prisoners spent months with their hands tied or chained. This became known as the shackling crisis. It lasted from 1942 to 1943 before both sides finally agreed to stop. For the prisoners, every day in the camps was a struggle. They were hungry, cold, and far from home. Many wondered if they would ever see Canada again. Back in Canada, the news broke on August 20th, 1942. Newspapers across the country printed casualty lists. The lists seemed to go on forever. Small communities were devastated. The Royal Regiment of Canada had recruited entire companies from single towns. When those companies were wiped out, whole towns went into mourning. Huntsville, Ontario, was a town of only 3,500 people. They lost 37 men at Dieppe, 37 young men from one small town, gone in a single day. Mothers received telegrams, wives received telegrams. The telegrams all said the same thing: missing in action, killed in action, wounded in action, prisoner of war. The grief was overwhelming. At first, newspapers tried to spin the raid as gallant and heroic. They called it a success, but families demanded the truth. They wanted to know why their sons and husbands had died. They wanted to know what the raid had accomplished. The government struggled to give them answers that made sense. British command had different reactions. Lord Louis Mountbatten, the commander of combined operations who planned the raid, made a public statement. "For every man lost at Dieppe, 10 were saved on D-Day," he said. What is remarkable about this quote is that he said it before D-Day even happened. He was already thinking about the lessons learned. In private correspondence, Winston Churchill knew the raid was a disaster, but he needed political cover. He needed to convince Stalin and Roosevelt that Britain was taking action. He needed to show that the raid taught valuable lessons. Combined Operations Headquarters immediately began analyzing every detail of what went wrong. They started writing reports before the wounded had even been treated. The German reaction was one of celebration mixed with confusion. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the German commander in the west, said confidently, "The enemy learned nothing." He was completely wrong, but he did not know it yet. German High Command believed they had discouraged any Allied invasion plans for years to come. They thought the Dieppe victory proved the Atlantic Wall was unbeatable. This belief would lead to crucial mistakes later. Adolf Hitler was thrilled with the news from Dieppe. It reinforced his belief that static defenses could stop any invasion. He ordered even more resources poured into building bunkers and fortifications along the coast. German propaganda celebrated the Dieppe victory endlessly. They showed newsreels of captured Canadians and burning Allied tanks. They wanted the world to see what happened when you attacked Fortress Europe. The human cost went beyond simple numbers. Les Fusiliers Mont-Royal, the French-Canadian unit sent in as reserves, suffered 95% casualties. 95%. Almost every man in the unit was killed, wounded, or captured. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry lost officers and sergeants from single blocks back in Hamilton. Entire neighborhoods lost their leaders. The Essex Scottish Regiment had recruited companies from the same factories and neighborhoods in Windsor and Essex County. Friendship groups that had grown up together, worked together, and joined the army together were wiped out together. The Calgary tank sent 29 tanks to Dieppe. Only 14 tank crews returned, and 7 of those crews were wounded. The bonds between these men made their losses even more painful. They were not just losing fellow soldiers, they were losing brothers, cousins, neighbors, and best friends. But amid all the horror, there were also moments of humanity that showed war had not destroyed everything good in people. German medics came down onto the beach to treat Canadian wounded. They gave them water and bandages. They carried them to shelter. French civilians in Dieppe risked their lives to hide wounded Canadians in their homes. If the Germans found them, they would be sent to concentration camps. But they did it anyway because it was the right thing to do. German soldiers shared cigarettes with Canadian prisoners as they marched them away from the beach. One German officer found a wedding ring on a captured Canadian officer. Instead of keeping it, he returned it before sending the Canadian to a prison camp. These small acts of kindness mattered. They reminded men on both sides that their enemies were human beings, not monsters. The broader significance of what happened was already beginning to reveal itself. Captain John Hughes Hallett, the Naval Force commander, spoke to Mountbatten the day after the raid. "We just learned how not to invade Europe," he said. That same day, they established the Dieppe Analysis Committee. Every after-action report was collected. Every soldier who made it back was debriefed. Every piece of wreckage was studied. What went wrong? Why did it go wrong? How could it be fixed? The answers to these questions were being written even as Canadian families mourned their dead. The disaster at Dieppe changed everything about how the Allies would fight the rest of the war, though it took time for people to understand this. In the fall of 1942, Allied planners sat in rooms surrounded by reports from Dieppe. They read every interview with survivors. They studied every photograph of the beach. They examined pieces of destroyed landing craft and damaged tanks. Slowly, a picture emerged. The picture showed them exactly what not to do. And in war, knowing what not to do can be just as valuable as knowing what to do. The first major decision came quickly. Plans for invading France in 1943 were cancelled. Dieppe proved the Allies were not ready. They did not have the right equipment. They did not have the right tactics. They did not have enough experience. Rushing into another invasion would just create another disaster, but bigger. Instead, the Allies shifted their focus to North Africa in Operation Torch, then to Sicily. They would attack the edges of Hitler's empire first, gaining experience and buying time to prepare properly. Between 1942 and 1944, a complete revolution in amphibious warfare tactics took place, and Dieppe was the spark that started it. The first problem to solve was landing craft design. The boats used at Dieppe were too slow, too vulnerable, and not specialized enough. Engineers went to work creating new designs. They built the LCT, or Landing Craft Tank, specifically designed to carry tanks safely to shore. They built the LCI, Landing Craft Infantry, to carry soldiers more efficiently. They built the LST, Landing Ship Tank, which could carry enormous amounts of equipment across the ocean and then land it directly on beaches. They also developed something called the DUKW, an amphibious truck that could drive through water and then up onto land. This solved the supply problem that crippled the Dieppe forces. Additionally, a British officer named Percy Hobart designed specialized armored vehicles that became known as Hobart's Funnies. These strange-looking tanks could clear mines, lay bridges over obstacles, and destroy bunkers. They were specifically designed to solve problems the Canadians faced at Dieppe. The second lesson was about naval fire support. At Dieppe, only 8 destroyers provided gunfire support for the landing. Their small guns barely scratched the German concrete bunkers. After studying the disaster, planners realized they needed massive naval bombardment before troops ever hit the beach. For D-Day, the Allies allocated 7 battleships, 23 cruisers, and 105 destroyers to provide gunfire support. That is compared to 8 destroyers at Dieppe. The difference was enormous. They also developed special rocket-firing landing craft that could launch hundreds of rockets at beach defenses just before the soldiers landed. The goal was to suppress enemy fire so completely that soldiers would have a chance to get off the beaches alive. The third major change was in landing strategy itself. Dieppe taught the Allies to never assault a fortified port directly. Ports were too heavily defended. The Germans would fight to the death to hold them because ports were so valuable. The solution was brilliant in its simplicity. Land on open beaches between the ports, then isolate the ports and force them to surrender. For D-Day, the Allies chose the beaches of Normandy. Gold Beach, Juno Beach, Sword Beach, Utah Beach, and Omaha Beach were all open coastline, not ports. Once the Allies established their beachhead, they would surround ports like Cherbourg and capture them from behind. But this created a new problem. How do you supply an army without a port? The answer was the mulberry harbors. These were artificial ports that the Allies built in England, towed across the English Channel, and assembled on the Normandy coast. They literally brought the port with them. This idea came directly from the Dieppe disaster. Coordination between air, sea, and land forces was another crucial lesson. At Dieppe, communication broke down almost immediately. Officers on the beach could not talk to commanders on ships. Ships could not coordinate with aircraft. Aircraft did not know where friendly troops were. After Dieppe, the Allies created entirely new command structures for amphibious operations. They developed new radio equipment that worked better. They required extensive training where all 3 services practiced working together. The goal was to make sure everyone knew what everyone else was doing at all times. Beach reconnaissance became almost an obsession after Dieppe. The Allies had assumed the Dieppe beach was sand. It was actually stones. This one mistake contributed to the disaster. Never again would they make an assumption like that. They established special teams called Combined Operations Pilotage Parties, or COPs. These were underwater reconnaissance teams that swam to enemy beaches at night. They measured the depth of the water. They checked the composition of the sand or stones. They looked for obstacles and mines. They mapped underwater approaches. Before D-Day, these teams surveyed the Normandy beaches so thoroughly that Allied planners knew the exact gradient of every beach, the exact composition of the sand, and the location of every obstacle. Small submarines called X-craft also mapped underwater approaches to the beaches. Nothing was left to chance. Timing became a science. At Dieppe, the timing of the tides caused problems for landing craft. Some could not get close enough to shore. Others got stuck on the beach when the tide went out. After Dieppe, understanding tide tables became a strategic priority. Weather forecasting also became critically important. D-Day was almost canceled because of bad weather. The decision to go on June 6, 1944, was based on a tiny window of good weather that forecasters predicted. Eisenhower trusted their predictions because the Allies had learned at Dieppe that you cannot fight the weather. Finally, deception became a major part of invasion planning. The Allies created elaborate fake operations to make the Germans think the invasion would come somewhere else. Operation Fortitude convinced the Germans that the main invasion would hit Calais, not Normandy. This deception was crucial to D-Day's success. The statistical impact of these changes was dramatic. At Dieppe, 6,000 men landed, and 68% became casualties in just 9 hours. The operation failed completely. At D-Day, 156,000 men landed on the first day. The average casualty rate on most beaches was about 5%. Only Omaha Beach, which had problems similar to Dieppe, saw casualties around 10%. If D-Day had suffered Dieppe's casualty rate, there would have been 106,000 casualties on the first day instead of the actual 10,000. Military historians estimate that the lessons learned at Dieppe saved between 80,000 and 100,000 Allied lives on D-Day alone. The Canadian sacrifice at Dieppe literally saved an army. Specific D-Day successes came directly from Dieppe lessons. Juno Beach, Elysian, was the Canadian sector on D-Day. Canadian forces applied every single lesson they had learned in blood 2 years earlier. They advanced 6 miles inland on D-Day, farther than any other Allied force. The specialized armor from Hobart's Funnies cleared obstacles that had stopped tanks at Dieppe. The massive naval bombardment suppressed German defenses in ways that 8 destroyers never could. Landing between ports instead of attacking them directly allowed the Allies to establish their beachhead. The Mulberry harbors solved the supply problem that destroyed the Dieppe operation. The impact spread beyond just Europe. The United States Marines studied Dieppe reports extensively. Every lesson was incorporated into their plans for attacking Japanese-held islands in the Pacific. The assault on Tarawa in 1943 used many Dieppe lessons about naval gunfire and reconnaissance. Every Pacific amphibious operation from 1943 to 1945 benefited from what the Canadians learned at Dieppe. British military doctrine was completely rewritten based on Dieppe. Combined operations became a formal discipline with specialized training centers. Dieppe became required study at every military staff college in Britain. Ironically, Dieppe also affected German military thinking, though in ways that hurt them. Hitler was convinced by the Dieppe victory that the Atlantic Wall worked perfectly. He poured more resources into building static defenses. He kept valuable mobile reserves away from the coast because he thought fixed fortifications could stop any invasion. When D-Day came, German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel wanted mobile reserves positioned close to the beaches. Hitler overruled him, partly because Dieppe had convinced Hitler that static defenses were enough. The German reaction to Dieppe actually helped D-Day succeed. Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Merritt became the face of Canadian courage at Dieppe. He was the officer who stood on the bridge at Thiant, Pourville waving his helmet and shouting, "Come on over, there's nothing to worry about here," while bullets flew past his head. His bravery was so remarkable that he was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest military honor in the British Commonwealth. But Merritt's story did not end with his medal. He was captured at Dieppe and spent the next 3 years in a German prisoner of war camp called Oflag Samaman B. The camp was cold, the food was terrible, and every day felt like a year. But Merritt survived. He returned to Canada in 1945 and was elected to Parliament. He spent the rest of his life fighting for veterans, making sure they received the care and recognition they deserved. Merritt died in the year 2000 at age 90. Until his last days, he defended the men who fought at Dieppe. He never stopped telling people that those soldiers were heroes, even if the mission failed. Jack Poulton was the soldier mentioned at the very beginning of this story. He was one of the few men from the Royal Regiment of Canada to survive the horror of Blue Beach. Almost everyone in his unit was killed or captured. Poulton himself was captured and sent to a German prison camp called Stalag AEB. He survived 3 years as a prisoner of war, enduring hunger, cold, and the constant fear that he might never see home again. When the war ended in 1945, Poulton returned to Canada. But he carried the beach with him everywhere he went. He struggled with terrible survivor's guilt. Why did he live when his friends died? What made him special? These questions haunted him every day. For decades, Poulton dedicated himself to telling the stories of the men who did not come home. He visited schools and talked to students about Dieppe. He wanted young people to remember his friends. Poulton died in 2007 at age 86, still carrying the weight of that terrible morning. Corporal Fred Engelbrecht was the man who volunteered to stay behind with the wounded during the evacuation. He knew staying meant capture. He knew it meant years in a prison camp. But he looked at the wounded men around him and realized someone had to stay. They were his friends. He could not leave them alone. Engelbrecht spent 3 years as a prisoner of war. When he returned to Canada, he became a high school teacher in Ontario. For almost 50 years, he never spoke about Dieppe. His students had no idea he was a war hero. In 1992, a newspaper ran an article about him. Suddenly, everyone wanted to hear his story. He finally agreed to speak at schools in the 1990s. He told students that he wanted them to understand the real cost of war. War is not just about battles and victories. War is about the people who never came home. Engelbrecht died in 2007, having lived a quiet, good life despite the horrors he witnessed. Not everyone survived. Lieutenant John Council was only 23 years old. He came from Windsor, Ontario, and was part of the Essex Scottish Regiment. He was killed on Red Beach, in the first wave of the attack. His body was never recovered from the beach. Today, his name is inscribed on the Brookwood Memorial in Surrey, England, along with hundreds of other Dieppe soldiers who have no known grave. Before he left for the raid, Council wrote a letter to his fiancée back home. The last line of that letter said, "Whatever happens tomorrow, know I fought for something important." His fiancée kept that letter for the rest of her life. Private Frank Ryan was 19 years old and came from Hamilton. He was part of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry. During the battle, Ryan saw a wounded friend lying exposed to German fire. He ran out to help his friend and was shot dead. His squad of 10 men all came from the same street in Hamilton. Ryan was the only one killed. The 9 survivors carried guilt about his death for the rest of their lives. They held annual reunions to remember him. The last of those 9 men died in 2003, and the reunions ended. But they never forgot Frank Ryan. The German soldiers who fought at Dieppe had their own stories. Lieutenant Heinz Schroeder defended a bunker on White Beach. His machine gun killed dozens of Canadians that day. In a 1976 interview, he said something remarkable. "I felt no joy in that victory. I saw brave men sent to die for nothing. I counted 37 Canadian bodies in front of my position. 3 were teenagers. After the war, Schroeder emigrated to Canada in 1952. He sought out Dieppe veterans and became friends with some of them. He spoke at Dieppe memorials about how war affects everyone, not just the losers. He said he saw the Canadians as human beings, not enemies. Hauptmann Richard Schneusenberg commanded German artillery on the cliffs above Dieppe. His guns devastated the landing craft as they approached the beach. He was very good at his job, and that haunted him. He was captured in 1944 during the fighting in Normandy. Canadian soldiers interrogated him. He told them, "Dieppe taught you well. This time you got it right." Years later, he admitted that his success at Dieppe never stopped bothering him. "I was efficient at killing boys," he said. That efficiency gave him no pride. French civilians in Dieppe also became part of the story. Marie-Thérèse Lemaitre was only 16 years old during the raid. She and her family hid a wounded Canadian soldier in their cellar for 3 days. The Gestapo discovered what they had done. Marie-Thérèse and her mother were sent to a concentration camp as punishment. Both survived the camp, though barely. In 1947, Marie-Thérèse was reunited with the Canadian soldier she'd saved. He arranged for her and her mother to immigrate to Canada. She spent the rest of her life working to strengthen friendship between France and Canada. She died in 2015 at age 89, proud of what she had risked for a stranger. Recognition for the Dieppe veterans came slowly and incompletely. Cecil Merritt received the Victoria Cross. 4 men received the Distinguished Service Order. 52 received the Military Cross. 264 other decorations were awarded. But many acts of heroism went unrecorded because too few witnesses survived. Recommendations for medals were lost when headquarters evacuated in chaos. The British government initially tried to minimize the disaster, which meant downplaying Canadian heroism. It took years of fighting to get proper recognition for what those men did. Many heroes died before they ever received the honors they deserved, but their families never forgot. Their children and grandchildren made sure their stories were told. They created oral history projects to record the memories of survivors before they died. They attended ceremonies in Dieppe every August 19th. They made sure the sacrifice was remembered, even when the veterans themselves were gone. In Canada today, the memory of Dieppe lives on in stone and steel monuments scattered across the country. In Windsor, Ontario, there is a park called the Dieppe Veterans Memorial Park. It was unveiled in 1979 and features a bronze statue of a Canadian soldier. Nearby, plaques list the names of local men who died on that August morning. In dozens of small Ontario towns, you can find similar plaques listing their dead. Huntsville remembers its 37 lost sons. Hamilton remembers the men of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry. These memorials matter because they keep the names alive. The Royal Regiment of Canada has a museum that displays artifacts from Dieppe: rusted helmets, torn uniforms, letters written the night before the raid. Every August 19th, ceremonies are held across Canada, though fewer people attend each year as the veterans die and memories fade. The last Dieppe veteran died in 2018. The men who actually experienced the horror are all gone now. Only their stories remain. In France, the memory is even stronger. The Dieppe Canadian War Cemetery holds 707 graves. Most of those graves contain men who died on August 19, 1942. The cemetery sits on a hillside overlooking the sea. It is peaceful and beautifully maintained. Local French volunteers care for the graves with devotion. They plant flowers. They clean the headstones. They treat the cemetery as sacred ground. In the town of Dieppe itself, there is a monument on the beach listing all the Canadian units that fought there. An avenue running through the town is named Avenue des Canadiens in their honor. Every single year on August 19th, French and Canadian flags are flown together. A ceremony is held on the beach where so many died. Local residents attend, even though the battle happened over 80 years ago. The current mayor of Dieppe says the same thing every year. We will never forget. They died for our freedom. The bond between Dieppe and Canada remains strong. Town twinning programs connect Dieppe with Canadian cities. Student exchange programs send young Canadians to France and young French students to Canada. These programs are funded by veterans associations who want the connection to continue. In Britain, the memory is more complicated. At the Brookwood Memorial near London, there is a wall listing 555 Canadians from Dieppe who have no known grave. Their bodies were never recovered from the beach or the sea. The National Memorial Arboretum has a section dedicated to Dieppe, but overall, Dieppe is less prominent in British memory than in Canadian or French memory. This is partly because the British feel conflicted about the raid. It was planned by British commanders, but executed by Canadian soldiers. The disaster raises uncomfortable questions about British leadership that many prefer not to discuss. Dieppe shaped the modern world in ways most people never realize. Every military academy in the world that teaches amphibious assault doctrine includes Dieppe as a case study. The United States Marine Corps requires its officers to study the raid. What went wrong? What could have been done differently? How did the lessons apply to D-Day? NATO alliance doctrine incorporates the analysis of Dieppe into its teaching. Modern amphibious operations still apply the same lessons today. Do extensive reconnaissance. Use overwhelming firepower. Coordinate all forces perfectly. Use specialized equipment designed for the mission. These principles came from Dieppe. The raid also became part of Canadian national identity. Canada's World War II narrative follows an arc. First came Hong Kong in 1941, where Canadians were sacrificed defending a hopeless position. Then came Dieppe in 1942, another sacrifice. But then came D-Day in 1944, where Canadians triumphed and proved their competence. Finally came the liberation of the Netherlands, where Canadians were welcomed as heroes and saviors. Dieppe fits into this story as a moment of sacrifice that was not in vain. It reinforced Canadian military pride as separate from British command. Canadians fought bravely even when their leaders failed them. This became an important part of how Canada sees itself. The relationship between France and Canada was strengthened by Dieppe. The French people in Dieppe never forgot that Canadians died trying to liberate them. Even though the raid failed, the intent mattered. French civilians risked their lives to help wounded Canadians. After the war, this created a special bond. Annual pilgrimages bring Canadian families to Dieppe to see where their grandfathers and great-grandfathers fought. French families host these Canadian visitors. The friendship between the two countries was literally built on the stones of that beach. The great debate about Dieppe continues even today. Was it a necessary sacrifice or criminal incompetence? In the 1940s and 1950s, most people believed it was necessary to test German defenses. In the 1960s and 1970s, historians became more critical. They blamed Lord Mountbatten for criminal incompetence and accused him of wasting Canadian lives. In the 1980s and 1990s, the view became more nuanced. Yes, the planning was terrible. Yes, the execution was disastrous. But the lessons genuinely did save lives at D-Day. Both things can be true. Since the 2000s, most historians accept that Dieppe was both a tragedy and a turning point. It should never have happened the way it did, but the lessons learned were genuinely important. The descendants of Dieppe veterans carry the story forward. Jack Poulton's grandson became a military historian who specializes in Dieppe. He spent years researching the raid, trying to understand what his grandfather experienced. He discovered something his grandfather never knew. The D-Day planners studied Dieppe page by page. Every report, every interview, every lesson was incorporated into the D-Day plans. Poulton's grandson said, "Grandpa died believing it was for nothing. I wish he had lived to read the D-Day planners' reports. They studied Dieppe like it was a textbook." Cecil Merritt's daughter said something similar. "Father never called himself a hero. He called himself lucky. The heroes, he said, didn't come home." The final statistical reckoning tells the story best. 916 Canadians were killed on August 19, 1942. Military historians estimate that 80,000 to 100,000 Allied lives were saved on D-Day because of the lessons learned at Dieppe. That means for every Canadian who died at Dieppe, approximately 87 to 109 Allied soldiers survived D-Day who otherwise would have died. They literally changed the war without realizing it. They thought they were failing. They thought their mission was pointless. Many died believing they had accomplished nothing, but every observation, every failure, every death taught the Allies something crucial about how to win the war. In 2012, on the 70th anniversary of the raid, the Canadian government finally issued a formal statement. Dieppe was essential to D-Day's success. Veterans Affairs Canada created a comprehensive educational program to teach students about the raid. A major documentary called The Raid on Dieppe was broadcast across Canada. The last 15 living veterans attended a ceremony in Dieppe that year. Most were in their 90s. They stood on the beach where they had fought 7 decades earlier. Some cried. Some saluted their fallen friends. All of them wondered why they survived when so many others did not. Dieppe represents war's most painful paradox. The men who died there could not know that their failure would save countless lives. They charged into hopeless situations believing they had failed their mission. But they had actually completed a different mission entirely. They taught the Allies how to win the war. Private Jack Poulton, stumbling off that landing craft into hell, changed World War II more than most generals. He just never knew it. The lesson is not just military, it is human. Sometimes our greatest contributions come from our darkest moments. Sometimes failure teaches more than victory. Sometimes the people who change everything are the last ones to realize it. On the Dieppe memorial stone overlooking the beach, these words are carved. In memory of the officers, NCOs and men of the Allied forces who fell at Dieppe on the 19th of August 1942. They gave their lives that others might live in freedom. Beneath the official inscription, less formally but more truthfully, someone carved 4 simple words. They taught us how to win. That is exactly what the Canadians did at Dieppe without realizing it. They taught the Allies how to win by showing them how not to lose. Their disaster became the blueprint for victory. Their failure became the foundation for success. And though they never knew it, those 916 men who died on the stones of Dieppe changed the course of World War II and saved an army that would liberate Europe 2 years later.